Hello, my name's Andy Gillies. I'm a conference interpreter and interpreter trainer, and I've been asked to say something about simultaneous with text. So what is simultaneous with text? Well, very often when we're interpreting, we the interpreters will be provided with a text that corresponds to the speech that we are to interpret. And that can be a good thing, it can be helpful, but it can also be a hindrance to good interpreting. And depending on when we get the text, at what time, there are also different approaches that we might like to take to dealing with that text. And those two things are going to be the subject of today's film. Now, when I was asked to make this film, I had a little think about what I do with texts when I'm given them to interpret with. And then I looked at what material was available online, both practical material and research material. And simultaneous with text is not a particularly broad science. It's actually relatively straightforward. Most colleagues seem to agree on the broad outlines of what we should do. So approximately, colleagues tend to agree on what to annotate and how to annotate it. So for example, highlighting things, changing complex structure in texts, or jotting down good target language versions of expressions or words. There tends to be agreement also that the text is not going to help you understand the original, but it's going to help you produce a better interpretation. So that means we go fishing in the text for specifics, but we're really listening to the spoken word to understand the speech. And there's also agreement on the fact that depending on when you get the text, our approach to how to prepare it will differ. And there's agreement really that there are 3 or 4 different time periods or moments in time when we might get the text and the impact that will have. If you're interested in further reading, I would refer you to the bibliography at the bottom of this page. The main experts in this field would be Kate Davies, Robin Setton and Andrew Dawrant in their book, and Kilian Seeber. So if you're interested, as I say, I would recommend you go and have a look at some of their work, which is available. But one thing I would say right from the word go is whether or not you've had time to prepare your text, once the speech actually starts, it may be a good idea to put the piece of paper to one side and concentrate on interpreting the spoken word. And there are a number of reasons that that is a good idea, perhaps a safer idea, than religiously holding onto the text and trying to read into the text. First of all, the speaker is not bound by the text that they've given you. So you may have a version of the speech, but it may not tally with the version that the speaker reads out. They may have changed it, they may miss paragraphs, they may decide to skip a paragraph. The famous words check against delivery are usually written at the top of any speech text that you're handed in the booth. Another reason you might want to put this text to one side is that the cognitive load of looking at and reading a text at the same time as you're doing simultaneous interpreting is simply greater, and that therefore brings with it the risk that you are distracted by the text and you miss out some of the information that you're actually listening to. Third reason that you may want to put the text to one side and concentrate on the spoken word is that if you have prepared it and annotated it, then you will probably remember the text as you hear the spoken word. So memory will kick in and help. Lastly, the listening is quicker than reading, and so it will be quicker to listen and interpret that rather than try to interpret or sight translate the written text. So it's worth glancing at the text to pick items out, like numbers, names, acronyms. But my opinion is that it's much more difficult to do a sight translation of the text than it is to do a simultaneous interpretation of the spoken speech. So moving on to the time periods involved. Most interpreters will divide up the time periods involved into 3. So the moments in time when we get the speech. Sometimes, number 1, you get the speech and the speaker has already begun speaking. Second moment in time, you get the text of the speech, you have some time to prep it, but you don't have all the time that you need to prepare it. If you don't, for example, have time to read the entire speech. And then thirdly, the ideal situation, you do have enough time to read and prepare the speech at your leisure. So now the last 2 categories are not necessarily strictly separated from one another. A lot will depend on how long the speech is and how much time you have to prepare. And that's why I haven't given a set of minutes. I haven't said when you get the speech 10 minutes ahead of time, for example. But I prefer to think of it as, do you have time to read the whole speech or not? Because sometimes you'll get the text of a 20-minute speech, sometimes you get the text of a 2-minute speech. Obviously, the key thing there is whether you have time to read the whole thing, not whether you have 5 minutes available. So I divide them up into, you get the text during the speech, you get the text when you don't have enough time to read it all, so a rush job, and then the ideal situation where you do have time to read and prep the whole speech. And we'll look at those 3 scenarios separately now. Okay, so the first scenario is you get the speech, or the speech is made available to you after the speaker has already begun speaking. This may be as a piece of paper brought round to the booth, or it may be that it appears on whichever website you're using to get your documentation from. Either way, you as the working interpreter probably can't do anything with the text at this stage. The most important job to be done here is actually by your booth partner. If they become aware that the text is available, or if someone comes into the booth and hands a paper text of the speech to you or your partner, it's your booth partner who should take the text, find the place that the speaker has arrived at in the speech, and then hand the text to the working interpreter, pointing at the place where the speaker has arrived at. And then the working interpreter can see where they're up to and decide whether to follow the text as the speech goes along or not. But that's the most useful thing that you can do at that stage. Obviously, handing your colleague a piece of paper or handing them an iPad or a tablet is considerably easier than handing them a laptop, but sometimes you may just have to hand them a laptop. Now, I would repeat what I said a moment ago. At this stage, if you're the interpreter interpreting, you probably don't want to focus too much on the text. Just because you have the text doesn't mean that you have to use it, and I would certainly avoid doing sight translation suddenly from a text that you haven't prepared at all. Glance at the text to pick out numbers, proper names, acronyms, and that will probably be everything that the text can do for you. You might, one thing I like to do sometimes that helps me focus is I will annotate keywords in the text, not in advance, but as we go along. So I hear a keyword, I see that that keyword is also in the text, and I might annotate it. That just helps me focus on the main point of the speech. And it might also be that that same idea comes up later in the speech, and I've sort of anchored it in my memory by highlighting it in the text. But that's pretty much all you can do with the text if you get it whilst the speech is already underway. Okay, so let's look at the second scenario. And this is the rush scenario, in which you don't have time to read the whole text that you've been provided with. And in my experience, this is the most common format. You get a text, but you don't have time to read the whole thing, either because you just physically don't have that much time, so for example 10 minutes to read a 20-minute text, or simply because you have so much other preparation to do that you decide you're going to do a quicker preparation on a speech that you have the text of. Right, so before we get to the very practical side of how to annotate and what exactly we want to do to the text, I'll just say something about the technical side of things and the format of the document. We interpreters don't get a choice of the format that the document is provided in. It's simply provided to us. So that could be paper hard copy, it could be a PDF, or it could be a Word document. All of the techniques that I'm going to describe work on any of the three formats. I would just express a preference for PDFs and paper because you can handwrite on them, and handwriting anchors things in your memory a bit better. So I find handwritten annotation slightly better for activation than typing things into a PDF or a Word document. The other thing that I would recommend if something does come to you as a Word document is to convert it into a PDF. First of all, because, well, there's several things. Convert into a PDF. Also, upgrade to a slightly larger font and to double line spacing. Why? Well, first of all, the larger font and the double line spacing will be more visible, easier to read, and you'll have more space for your annotations. And I recommend going from Word to PDF because then any annotations you make will be very clearly distinguishable from the original speech. You definitely want to be clear about what the original text is and what the annotations that you've made are. And I find that quite difficult in a Word document, a little bit more time consuming. If you have a quick look at the film I'm showing now, you can see that once you're familiar with the process, this only takes a matter of 20 or 30 seconds. Okay, so let's have a look now at what the simultaneous interpreter receiving the text in advance of the speech, but not with sufficient time to read the whole thing thoroughly and prepare it thoroughly, might actually do with that speech. Well, the first thing, and the vast majority of interpreters that I have spoken to, and anything that I've read about interpreting, seem to agree that the first thing to do is to read the first and last paragraph of the speech, assuming that they're not pure formalities. So it might be that you want to read the first and second paragraph and the last paragraph and the penultimate paragraph. But very often that will give you an extremely good idea of where the speech is going to go and what it's about. And if you look at the example on the screen, this was a speech that was given on the 4th of March 2021, so in the middle of COVID. It was 2 days away from Women's Day, and it was given in Brussels in the European Parliament. And just from the highlights that I make that you can see to the first paragraph, where the speaker says that they are the female director of a major hospital in Brussels, and the last paragraph where she highlights that she feels that public health care is a really important issue that should be a priority for government, the interpreter can anticipate a lot of what's going to come up in the speech. So just from those highlights, I have a pretty good idea that we're going to be talking about fighting COVID on the front line, the problems that the health sector was faced with, overworked health staff, perhaps tented villages to take extra beds in the hospital, intensive care units and the problems related to that, ventilators, PPE problems, women in healthcare, because healthcare is an area where there are traditionally more women, but perhaps not in management roles. So all of that we can anticipate relatively quickly just from looking at the first and last paragraph of the speech and extrapolating. Another really useful thing that you can do if you have the speech ahead of time is to look for whether the speaker themselves have included in the text they've provided headings or highlights. Again, if you look at the speech on the screen now, you can see that the speaker themselves have highlighted certain passages in the speech. It seems relatively obvious, therefore, for the interpreter, once they've looked at the first and last paragraphs of a speech, to then look at the speaker's highlights. What the speaker considers to be important is probably going to be useful for the interpreter as well. Now, depending on whether you have time and depending on your personal preference for preparation, there are a couple of other things that you might want to do when you have the text in advance but you don't have time to read the whole thing. So you could go through it paragraph by paragraph and highlight just one key word in each paragraph so that stands out. So that as you go through the speech, you have a little bit of advanced warning of what's coming in that paragraph of the speech. Some people like to highlight, as I mentioned earlier, names, numbers, and acronyms, although I feel they tend to stand out in the text alone because they're a different format, if you like. Numbers are numbers, and acronyms are often in capital letters, so they stand out without much help. Another tip at this stage that you could do, and works quite well from English into other languages, is to look through the speech and highlight the first line of every paragraph. But again, if you're highlighting key words, you probably don't need to highlight the first line of each paragraph. Those two would probably be an either-or option. And again, if you have a little bit of time, skim reading. If you know how to skim read, just glancing at each paragraph, that can be a useful thing to do when you don't have time to prepare the whole speech properly. And next we'll look now at the ideal situation where you do have time to read through and prep the whole speech just as you would like. Okay, so now we get to the ideal scenario. You have plenty of time to prepare the speech, you have time to read it all, and you have time to prep it as you would like. So what are you going to do with the speech? Most of the colleagues I talk to and most of the literature seem to agree that there are three main things that we're going to end up doing. We're going to be highlighting things, be that with a highlighter or a pen. We're going to be adjusting the structure of the speech so that the target language structure isn't too firmly fixed to the source language structure. And we're going to be writing in translations or target language versions of expressions and words that we find in the text. The aim is, and I lift this from Robin Setton and Andrew Dawrant's excellent book, the aim is that your annotations should be a representation of the text that helps you produce a good interpretation to convey the message properly. So the specifics then. Well, if you have enough time to read the text, you should read the text. Read the whole text. I'm going to list a number of different techniques now, and I've separated them for the point of this film. For pedagogical reasons, it's clearer if I show you them one at a time. In practice, experienced interpreters will do all of these things at the same time, possibly in one reading of the text. If you have time, it might be useful, however, to split them up as I have, and then you'll get a certain amount of repetition, which is good in preparation. And it might be a little bit clearer until you get very comfortable with these techniques. So, number one, read the whole text. The second thing you might like to do on a sort of macro level is to offer yourself a short summary of every single paragraph in the speech. And there are two ways that interpreters seem to do this. The first we've touched upon with the first and last paragraphs, and that is to highlight in each paragraph a few words that summarize the paragraph. My technique is to try and find a verb phrase, so subject, verb, possibly also an object, out of each paragraph and highlight them. So if I just read those words, I get a summary of the paragraph, and then to go through the whole speech like that. And if you look at the film that I'm showing now, you'll see for the same speech we saw earlier, I have done this with every paragraph of the speech. And so if I do this 2 or 3 days in advance, for example, because I have lots of time to prepare, before I interpret, I can quickly glance at the speech, look at what's highlighted in blue, and I'll have a quick reminder of the content of the whole speech. That's very useful. A second technique for doing exactly the same thing is to write that summary as consecutive notes in the margin on the page. And again, I've got an example on the screen now. This will depend a lot on your handwriting, the size of the margin, your pleasure in doing consecutive notes or not. But it achieves the same goal of offering you a quick summary of everything that's going on in the speech. Now, the second part of annotating a speech that we prep is really at a more micro level. So we go down to the nitty-gritty of the speech, and we have a very obvious technique, which is to look for expressions and terms that might be non-obvious, difficult to translate, or which might result in possible calque in the target language, and we want to avoid the calque. So I will highlight those in green and then write a translation next to them in green as well. And you'll notice here that I'm choosing a different color. So when I annotate content, as we saw in the previous films, I'll do it in blue. And now I'm annotating vocabulary and terminology, and I'm doing it in green. And again, that means when I come back to the speech, I can decide just 2 minutes, 5 minutes before I actually interpret, whether I want to have a quick look at the blue, the content, to remind me of the content, or whether I want to have a quick look through at the green and activate the vocabulary before the speaker sets off. Another really useful technique that we can do when annotating a text is to look for complex syntax in the text that might need to be rearranged in the target language. And that rearranging is quite difficult to do from the spoken word. And so we can give ourselves a head start by doing it on the written text. Now, a lot of this will depend on your language pair. So I work from Polish, German, and French into English. And those languages have slightly different stylistic and syntactic patterns than English. And there are certain things that I will like to annotate so as to make it easier to interpret whilst I'm listening to the speech. So the first one is very simple. In French, for example, adjectives come after the noun. And when you have 2 or 3 adjectives, that starts to become problematic if you're only listening to the speech. So what I will very often do is number the noun will be first in French and the adjectives will be second. So in English, I will look at the text and I will number the first adjective as 1, the second adjective as 2, the third adjective as 3, and then the noun, which comes first in the French text, I will number 4. And so then when I'm listening to the speech, I will already know that I can just leave that noun and put it in after my adjectives. So it basically reduces the burden on working memory. There's a similar example from German. Very often in German, the verb or the modal or the participle or the not will be at the end of the sentence. And that means quite a strain on working memory for the interpreter. So when you have the text, it can be quite useful to circle a subject and link it to its verb, which is also circled, via a line. And then you don't have to, again, burden working memory quite so much. You can also do more significant rearrangement of the text by moving whole phrases about. French very often puts parentheses in the middle of sentences in a different place to English, for example. And so I will happily draw brackets around parts of a sentence and then again number them 1, 2, 3. so that I can see which part of the sentence I should translate first and which second. And because I have a text, I can put much more, or there's much less burden on working memory, so I can hang on to a much larger chunk of text and say it later than I would be able to if I didn't have a text available to me. The next technique is distinguishing between primary or very important and secondary, less important information. This tallies a little bit with the summaries of paragraphs that I was talking about earlier. So I'll go through a text and I can see that the main part of a given sentence is the president has visited this factory. But in that same sentence you have parentheses with extra information that is attached to those main bits of the sentence. And I'll put those in brackets so that as I look at the text I can very clearly see what the main structure of the sentence is and what the information tagged onto that is. Still under this heading of reorganizing complex syntax, when you're annotating a text, you might want to break up longer sentences into shorter sentences. So for example, where there's a comma, you might decide to put a big full stop or a slash to indicate that you're adding a full stop, you're making a new sentence, or even a capital letter in the text, just to make it clear to you that you've decided you're going to make two sentences where the speaker had one very long one. And again, that can make the interpretation smoother, more fluid, and it reduces the burden on the working memory of the interpreter. So those techniques, I think, are the most important ones when you're annotating a text that you get in Simultaneous. But I will just mention two other options that are available to you. So if you have a lot of time and you're feeling particularly motivated, you can do a written translation of the text yourself. Now, you might want to do that, for example, if it's a very big occasion, it's an important speaker, or if your interpretation is going to be taken on relay by other interpreters and you're very keen to have a version that you're comfortable with and that is very solid. But there are some serious drawbacks to translating the whole speech in writing yourself. You can't just read out your translation because, as I mentioned earlier, the speaker may not stick to their own text. If you did a translation, my suggestion would be that you do a two-column version. You put the original in one column and your translation in another column. And then if the speaker does skip a paragraph or change a text, you might still be able to find the right place in the original and then your corresponding place in the translation. But there is a risk of getting things wrong when the speaker changes from the text that you've been given. You can also spend too much time and effort looking for the place in the translation and stop listening to the original speech and make mistakes because of that. So it's a technique to be taken with a big dose of caution. And similarly, well, I would say written translation is always a good exercise. It's a very good thing to do. And if you have translated the text, you might want to reread your translation before you go in, but then put that to one side in the same way that you put the text to one side, and then work from memory. Related technique to that, some interpreters will put a text of a speech through a translation engine like DeepL and use that translation as a basis. Again, if you're a relay interpreter, that might be helpful, but there are downsides to that as well. You still have to check the whole thing to make sure that DeepL hasn't made any glaring mistakes, and that's time consuming. And there is also a confidentiality issue. You have to make sure that you are allowed to put your speech text through a translation engine. So there are big downsides to those two last techniques, but I mention them because they are things that some interpreters are doing. So that's the end of today's film. I hope that those ideas and techniques will be useful to you, and I wish you all the best doing Simultaneous with text.